the EU migration and border governance from the masculinization of sovereignty to the rise of informal law. My name is Hannah Mühlenhoff. I am Assistant Professor of European Studies with a focus on Europe in the world. And I've organized this event together with Dimitris Bouris, Assistant Professor of EU Security, European External Relations. And the event was also made possible by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES. And I would like to especially thank Lisa Zares, who has helped us with technical support here and is also working in the background right now. So thank you very much. We are very happy to see you all in the audience for this event. We are really looking forward to a rich discussion and a very timely discussion. We had the EU Commission propose a new migration pact last week, so I think we have a lot to discuss. We are delighted to have such excellent speakers with us today, and I will introduce them briefly to you before we get started, and I will say a little bit about the plan for this event for the next hour. The first speaker is Paul James Cardwell. He's professor in law at the University of Strathclyde. His research is on the EU external relations and law, with a special focus on migration as well as democracy promotion policies. The second speaker for today is Ali Bilgic. He's a reader in international relations and security at Loughborough University, and his research is also on migration and human security as well as Turkey. And I'm also very happy that we have Beste Işleyen, our colleague, with us as a discussant today. She is senior lecturer in political science at the UvA, and she has also been doing extensive research on migration with a focus on the daily governance of migration and borders in Turkey. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us today. We're very happy to have you. And what we'll do in the following is we'll have two presentations, one by Paul and one by Ali, of 10 to 12 minutes. And then Beste will discuss both presentations from her research perspective. In the following, she will take 7 to 10 minutes or so. And then maybe I will let you, Ali and Paul, respond briefly to Beste's comments and discussion. And then we will, of course, also ask you, the audience, to send us questions that I will pass on to the speakers. So if you're not familiar yet, there's a Q&A box on your Zoom interface. Please use that to send us your questions, and I will do my best to pass them on to our speakers. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you as well, of course, during this event. And I suggest we get started. And Paul, would you like to take it away?
I would. Thank you very much, Hannah, for the invitation. I'm very sorry not to be there in Amsterdam, as I'm sure we all are. But thank you for the invitation, and in particular, thank you for an invitation which isn't to talk about Brexit, but instead migration, which is nevertheless an important topic, probably more important than Brexit. And thank you to everybody for coming along. It's lovely to see some familiar names on the list of attendees I can see on the time as well. What I'm going to talk about relates to my research that I've been doing and a book that I'm writing, which looks at formality and informality in migration governance. So as you heard from the introduction, I'm a legal scholar, and so my primary focus has been on the law, but it's not necessarily what I find the most interesting about migration, at least not in terms of how we have traditionally defined law to be. So to give a little background of how I came onto this topic, it's well known that the starting point for the ramping up of migration law and policy at EU level was the Treaty of Amsterdam, appropriately enough, back in 1998. And after that, we saw a raft of legislation aiming to harmonise, at the very least, minimum standards in particularly areas around asylum and reception and so on as well. It's worth mentioning that it took about 6 or 7 years for those pieces of legislation to be put into place, and that's something I'm going to come back to because the pattern of legislation follows very much what we know about EU law across different areas, such as free movement of goods and so on. Not only that, but particularly the single market, has relied on this model of regulations and directives to harmonise legislation and law across the EU. So migration was a new step. in doing so. Now, what interests me generally about legislation across different areas, not just migration, is that we are in a system that was originally built for 6 member states and now has 27. That's but according to an institutional format that's remained largely stable, although in migration and something else I'll come back to, we have got the emergence of new actors, particularly agencies and so on. What's interested me and what's a trend that various people, not just myself, spotted is that we have, and the latest migration, or proposed migration pact is just the latest one of these, various policy documents which include a focus on law as we've traditionally understood it, regulations and directives. But what really sparked my interest in this a few years ago is that at one point there seemed to be a greater focus on other things than law in order to meet goals. So the kind of language that's being used in the kind of documents like we have with the proposed migration pact, new migration pact, is things like all tools and instruments. Now, as a lawyer, then that immediately makes me think, well, what is that? You know, what does that mean? We know what regulations and directives are. They're defined. We know how they work. We know how transparent they are, how we can, as citizens, feed into it, how lobby groups can feed into it, and so on. What's all tools and instruments? What does this mean? And coming at it from the perspective of external relations, we know that the idea of law has been always somewhat different. But of course, migration is one of those that really straddles the two. It's dealing with the external, but most of the law that we've seen being made relates to the internal sphere, of course, of lawmaking within the EU. So I was very much interested in this distinction and where this notion of all tools and instruments came from and how much emphasis was being placed on that. Now, this is sometimes played out in literature between hard law and soft law. I tend not to use those terms because they can be a little bit confusing as to what's actually meant by them. And particularly you get into difficulties when you start talking about enforcement of law, which the Migration Pact itself says has been an issue in EU migration law. But the soft law agenda has particular resonance with the type of governance that we've seen in other areas of EU law. So, for example, in employment and social policy, we see a lot of kind of things like benchmarking and sharing of good practice, all of these things which are capable of producing effects in a similar way to the way law does, but without the transparency and so on. Now, in migration, we do see this a little bit, and it mainly explicitly refers to integration of migrants into society. So what are the different, benchmarking good practices that can be shared between states, local authorities, NGOs, civil society, and so on, in terms of reaching a goal of better integration? I don't think many of us would have too much of a problem with that. It speaks to something different than migration policy as we see it referred to in the Migration Pact, which is really very much focused on preventing people from coming into the EU via irregular means. The regular or legal means is not the main focus, and that continues a pattern that we've seen for many, many years. Now, the issue then, if you have with using all tools and instruments, is that by using language, and language here is very important, to reflect measures that are not defined within law is inherently problematic, because you're talking about lives, and you're talking about people in precarious situations, and you're talking about all kinds of related issues, such as how do you enforce particular rights? How do you ensure that the law is being applied properly, especially if you create situations in a vacuum, a physical vacuum? I mean, literally, if people are in boats in the middle of seas in international waters, but also in a legal vacuum too. Now, the best example of this would be the EU-Turkey statement from 2016. I say best example in terms of being the most visible and ones that we're often most familiar with. Now, very quickly, when this was made, it was referred to as an agreement. Now, in ordinary everyday English, or however it's translated into EU language or Turkish, I assume as well, agreement is a word that we would use on an everyday basis. But of course, when you use it in this context, it means something very specific. It means something that has gone through a particular process. It means something that's gone through a process which might involve the European Parliament, which goes through to other institutional actors, and so on. Whereas the EU-Turkey one did none of that. And we know that because when a case was brought to the General Court as a challenge, the General Court said, well, this is not, in fact, actually EU law. This is something else, which then can't be enforced. So one of the problems then is actually calling out what these things actually are and identifying them. So it's not an argument for not having this kind of soft law or new governance and so on, but how do we identify it? How do we know what it is? And the more different types of language and different words that get thrown out, whether it's deal, whether it's, well, not agreement, because that carries something specific, so that's avoided, but all of these tools, instruments, measures, and so on, means that actually tracking down what we're looking for and what effects they might have become extremely difficult. Now, in the migration, or the proposed migration pact, this language appears to have subsided. There's a much heavier emphasis actually on law, which slightly seems to undermine what my overall thesis was, because in previous iterations of these, the actual proposals for law or changing the law was the typing. I think that might be because there's two of us working up here. I'll just bear with me. I'm just they can hear the typing behind. Just bear with me a second. Put my headphones on. Sorry, there's two of us working up here. Put my headphones on, and hopefully that will bear with me. Sorry. Okay, can you still hear me? Great. Okay. Very sorry about that. The perils of working at home when there's more than one of you in a household. Where was it? Yeah, we can see from the migration pact proposal that the emphasis is on changing the law that we have and proposal of some law. But then when you get to about halfway through, then we start to see the relationships with third countries. And that's where the language also becomes very, very vague. It doesn't talk about specific agreements, except for things like readmission agreements. It talks about partners. Well, partners used to mean something specific as well. It used to be something that was founded on a partnership document. But here it just, well, actually, it doesn't talk about third countries at all. It just talks about partners. And that's something which is, in my view, a little bit problematic, because whilst this approach might help the EU to meet its goals in some way or another, the difficulty is actually how do we know what's going on and how can it be enforced? Added to that as well, as I referred to earlier, the complexity of the different bodies and their accountability. So the most notable, which would be Frontex, in a very complex legal system, can frustrate efforts to, once again, ensure that we can identify what's happening, and most importantly, the legal effect that this has on migrants, on individuals who find themselves in these very differentiated situations. So what this means as a consequence then, first and foremost, is, well, how do rights that are protected under national law, EU law, and under international law as well remain protected? And also, what does that tell us about the EU's own values? Because, again, written into the treaty are things like the absolute upholding of international law. What does this mean if international law is somehow bypassed? What does this tell us about the EU's own values and so on as well? It might be that the EU, in this pursuit of what we might see as being fortress Europe, sees that this is the best way to meet its goal, that it's responding to public. Okay, if that's the case. But on the other hand, we also know what these treaty commitments are, and therefore the scrutiny, the transparency, and the accountability is extremely important. So my overall argument is that whilst there are many reasons to use tools or instruments that are not defined, they have the flexibility, not everything can be done through law. We have to be extremely vigilant when they're being used in a migration context. There is something that's fundamentally different about this than it is in other areas where they've been used
where there was much greater buy-in about their effectiveness, where law has not always been the solution. So thank you very much. Apologies for the slight break, and I look forward very much to your questions on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Great. Ali, would you like to follow up right away?
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Dimitris, again for the invitation. I'm so sorry that I'm not in Amsterdam today with you, or actually in general. I wish I was in Amsterdam. I wish I was in Amsterdam. So hello, everybody. I'm going to take the discussion away from the legal law discussions to more informal side of things, where the general discourse of migration governance is situated in. I'm going to talk about emotions today, affective border work, I will call it. And but I think I'll start with first with a little illustration of what I'm going to talk about. So before that, I'd like to very quickly share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see that right now. So this is from The Sun. As you know, this is one of the worst tabloids in United Kingdom. And Dan O'Mahony, who is the clandestine channel threat commander, recently appointed, he wrote it for The Sun. And it says, "My job is to end illegal channel crossings, and that's what I will do." So what he's talking about here, many of you will remember the horror stories of people hiding in lorries trying to come here through the tunnel. And just a few weeks ago, a 20-year-old man died trying to make the dangerous crossing. His body washed up on a French beach, a stark reminder of the desperate risk being taken every day in the busiest shipping lane in the world. Be in no doubt that there are ruthless monsters. He's talking about smugglers here, selling desperate people a false dream that the UK is paved with gold. This is a lie. I can't argue with that. And of course, the photos are coming. His appointment, and Priti Patel is there as the Home Secretary. Unthinkable tragedy. His commitments to finish these channel crossings, against these ruthless thugs. And again, throughout my career in law enforcement and in the Royal Marines, I have fought against adversaries in high-risk environment on the land and at sea with the aim of protecting lives. The task ahead of me is grave and important as any I have faced. Every day this road remains open, we risk unthinkable tragedy. So what is this? What am I talking about here? This is exactly what I'm talking about today. The way that emotions are used in migration governance, the way that these emotions are circulated, repeated, and performed by the state authorities. So I call this affective bordering. Affective bordering refers to performances of sovereignty that reproduce sovereign authorities, state or non-state actor, as in the case of the EU, through invoking emotions in the audience in the context of migration governance. This is a gendered process where gendered norms of sovereignty are reenacted and reframed. In the European migration governance, affective bordering performances of states produce them as compassionate warriors, meaning masculinized protectors with a heart, wisdom, and prudence. Now I will briefly unpack this. Firstly, affective bordering is about performances of sovereignty. What do I mean by that? Whether you look at the US with border wall, or Europe with 3-layered walls in Ceuta and Melilla, or Australia with its offshore detention, sovereign authorities act in a play, which is wonderfully conceptualized by Nicola de Geneva as border spectacle. And I quote, "A spectacle of enforcement at the border, whereby migrant illegality is rendered spectacularly visible." The border becomes the stage, like in a theater, where border enforcement performatively activates the reification of migrant illegality in a gesture of exclusion. These performances reproduce migrants' illegality on the stage, and therefore legitimizes migrants' exclusion, and therefore they do the bordering or border work on the stage. In this spectacle, the main actor is the border guard, representing the sovereign authority. And although illegalized migrant is the reason of this performance, this show, they are made invisible through their exclusion. So when I said affective bordering as performances of sovereignty, I mean spectacular performances of sovereignty, which produces not only so-called illegal immigrant, but also the performer itself as the rightful and legitimate institution, which defines the borders of a political community. Secondly, border spectacle, where sovereignty is reproduced, has audiences. And one of the main audiences is the members of the political community who the state claims to protect. Performances need their audience. They need to be communicated, circulated, and repeated. The more they are communicated, circulated, and repeated, the more successful performances are. Just like those newspaper articles, it was one way of communication and circulation. And here, I would like to contribute to these debates in critical migration and border studies. Emotions do an important political work in the border spectacle of sovereign performances. What do I mean by emotions? In short, my understanding of emotions is based on Sara Ahmed, who asks one basic question: what emotions do politically? She argues that emotions reborder between the self, the subject who feels, and the other, the object of the self's emotions. Performances of sovereignty at this stage of border spectacle do emotional work. It invokes certain emotions in the audience, such as anxiety, fear, originating from the so-called invasion, as well as safety, security, originating from the performance itself. The state is protecting you from this so-called invasion. Through affective bordering, the border does not appear only where the performance happened. Affective borders, or emotional borders, are constructed and reconstructed between the subject, the self feels fear, and the object who is produced as fearsome. Exclusion happens here, effectively, and the other becomes invisible. Finally, affective bordering is a gendered practice. In the feminist international relations literature, mutually constitutive relationship between man, manhood, masculinity, and state, statehood, and sovereignty has been critically discussed for a long time now. It has been argued that the sovereignty is a masculinized and even hyper-masculinized political institution, which means that its ontology and practices are produced, normalized, and legitimized through masculinization. Masculinized states or sovereignty come in different forms. One is called the warrior masculinity. The state here is proactive, aggressive, brave protector. Another type is liberal masculinity. The state here is prudent, diplomatic, caring, and cooperative. These are ideal types, and in politics, states demonstrate different gender norms in relation to different issues. So what am I saying here? In affective bordering, sovereign performances produce the state as an embodiment of these two masculinities at the same time. On the one hand, the state performs the warrior role with new militarized tools along with a militarized discourse. On the other hand, it performs compassion to the other illegalized migrant, who is the victim of criminal networks, who are abusing them, lying to them, stealing from them, or forcing them to use clandestine migration routes. It is the state's humanitarian face, the heart, a performance of compassion, which is essential as the performance of fear in affective border governance. Compassionate warrior performances are repeated, communicated, and circulated. So emotions can be invoked, and therefore bordering between the feeling self and the other, who is the object of the self's feelings, can happen. And the other can be rendered invisible, excluded. So, before I conclude, in this short presentation, I've tried to conceptualize the productive relationship between stated sovereignty and migration governance through a gender prism and explore what the political work emotions do in this process. I believe this conceptualization might help us look at some political issues in migration governance in a different way, and there are three of them. First, compassion is not necessarily a friend of pro-migrant groups. The discourse of compassion, which has been often used to counter state practices, are essential for sovereign performances as well. Alternative discourses should be taught. And this is particularly where critical work on humanitarian border work has been discussing as well for a while. Second, we should not forget what the border spectacle is about: rendering migrants invisible. The compassionate warrior does this very well, particularly through compassion towards so-called victims. This takes away migrants' agency and voices. Any resistance to compassionate warrior should aim to make the migrants visible again. In academic works, this is as important as thinking about, working on, or criticizing sovereign practices. And finally, compassionate warrior does not want us to see a very important fact in this whole process: how the state's own practices are contributing to the tragedies of the compassionate warrior wants to tackle in the first place. Effective bordering completely conceals political responsibility from the discourse, and this is done through emotional appeals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Perfect. And also thank you for both sticking to this very limited amount of time very well. I just want to remind the audience that you can already send us questions in the Q&A box. And I would like to invite Beste to share her thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Thanks for the invitation. So I am following both of our speakers' work with great interest. What I'm going to do, without taking much time, because I'm sure that there will be very interesting and important questions, I want to maybe discuss them from different perspectives. And I want to start with Ali's point about the border spectacle, which I found really, really interesting. In the sense that you mentioned that migrants have become invisible, and then the savior comes and makes the migrants then visible through these works of saving lives and bringing compassion to border work, which has become an integral element of border management in Europe. I want to give another example where this border spectacle has become really important, which does not necessarily have this affective component. And with this, I mean the events which happened in February 2020, when Erdogan announced that the country opened the borders with the European Union, and thousands of migrants then were gathered at the Greek and Bulgarian land border. And this has become actually a border spectacle because for those of you who know this particular border, it is mostly a natural border with the river Evros, known as Maritsa or Meric, making up most of the border. And there is only a tiny land border there, which is fenced by Greece. And therefore, when the migrants are gathering there, they are in fact gathering at a very, very small place, which actually makes them look like, thousands of people gathered at a zone, and which actually creates these scenes of alarm and emergency. And I assume that this has importance in terms of its the political meaning also given to Europe. Because as you know, Turkey also has a very big and very long coastline with small bays, which actually enables border crossings quite easy for migrants to the Greek islands. But the very fact that this has become the border spectacle is really interesting, because I think there is something going on there to really show the emergency of the situation, the urgency of the situation. And I think the state, and there are also allegations and also reporting from the NGOs and from journalists that state officials also use buses to bring the migrants from their cities of residence to the border. And I think this is also a new way of showing us the performance of migration diplomacy. So diplomacy no longer takes place at the level of high politics, but diplomacy is also done through the bodies of the migrants, and the border spectacle also plays an important role there. Because why not the sea borders? Of course, it was winter, that would be a bit more difficult, but we shouldn't rule out the possibility that this could also be done with small ships, migrants departing from the Turkish shores to the Greek islands, but it wouldn't have given the same effect. Seeing thousands of people in a small border site, I think gave the message that, yeah, this is what you are facing with Europe, and listen to me. And I think this also invites us to maybe reconsider the way we understand migration diplomacy. It's no longer just limited to what's happening at the level of high politics. So in that way, the migrant was made ultra visible. And the compassion element, unfortunately, was missing during that time. But I think we can maybe reconsider the ways we understand how the performance sovereignty is taking place at the external borders of the European Union. And the second issue I want to make is about law. And Paul, I think you have given us a very excellent overview about the history of law and the law's place in EU migration policy. And I really, really like the way that you mentioned that informality is something that shouldn't be ignored or dismissed in our analysis. And I think that's really important, because I think we need to also consider that law is not static, but it is mobilized in ways that produce political effects. So we cannot say that law is no longer in place, so law is not obsolete, but it is adjusted, it becomes flexible, it becomes elastic, but it still plays a very important role. And we have seen this, for example, with the Turkey-EU deal in 2016. Before the deal, Turkey was labeled as a safe third country, because Turkey is a signatory of Geneva Convention, but it applies a geographical limitation to refugees coming from non-European countries. And this safe country concept was important for the legitimization of the Turkey-EU deal. And this has been seen when the Greek parliament passed a bill which redefined what a safe third country is. And then this geographical limitation then was then sidelined through this bill, and it enabled the justification of the agreement. So we just say that the legal understandings are also adjusted. And I also want to mention something that I read on Twitter this morning about some news stories coming from Greece about there are some allegations that the Greek secret services were sending people as migrants to Turkey to make them cross the border and then criminalize the NGOs in the Greek waters. So this is also super interesting, because we see that law is an important part. So criminalization of NGOs or humanitarian organizations are still very important, and we should take it into consideration when we understand the meaning of law, geography, etc. And I want to finish with something relating to my research, because most of the time when you do migration research and when you work on Turkey, you sit with lawyers in the room. And most of the time, my feeling is that the conversation comes to a point in which your scholar from a law department says, but it's illegal and it's unlawful. But then they say, then so what? But we have to move with the analysis. So we cannot just stop by saying that this agreement, for example, breaches EU asylum law. We have to go beyond that. So with my own research, what I try to do is that law, or an overemphasis on law, conceals more than it reveals. Therefore, in my research, I am calling for moving beyond law or legal requirements or legal obligations to the study of practices, and seeing what happens on an everyday basis, which might actually show that law is still important. But my own empirical research has shown that this overemphasis of law is not a way for us to see the real ways of border making, especially beyond the EU's external borders. And with this, I will finish, and I look forward also to the questions by the audience.
Thank you, Beste, for this very rich discussion. I would like to pass it on to the speakers. I add one question of my own. I was wondering between the relationship between the informality, this rise of informal law, and effective governance of migration, so the role of emotions. So kind of trying to link both of your talks and analysis together, how does it interrelate? How does maybe the role of the importance of the more informal aspects of law actually allow for this very effective governance of the border? So just to add a little bit to Beste's already rich discussion, and I will hand it over back to Paul. We can start with Paul again.
Okay, thank you very much for the, I see there's a couple of questions in as well on the side, so I'm going to try and answer yours, Hannah, and respond to you, Beste. Thank you very much for those. I mean, to take the emotions, first of all, I mean, law and particularly migration, and this, I think, links into particularly the Sun article that we had the pleasure of looking at, is that it's one of those areas that, you know, there are always demands for something must be done. And the something must be done, it's almost like instinctive then it's law, more law, more and more law. And it's not, I suppose, the only area that this is done, but I suppose it's the idea where we think that, you know, if you're talking even in a domestic sense, and we certainly see this a lot in the UK at the moment, dealing with the post-free movement context, it's like, well, we need, you know, with strict rules, we need to be certain of who can come in and who can come out. And of course, you know, certainty through is always what we want, but the idea then that you just keep adding to this and that the go-to solution is just more law means that you end up with a system that's so complex and often unenforceable. So the enforceability of law, I think, then speaks to Beste's point about, well, you know, something is illegal or not. Well, yes, but also how is law enforced? And that is implicitly recognized in, well, it's explicitly recognized in the Migration Pact that you can have, you know, this entirely coherent body of law, but if it's not actually being enforced, and of course what's required under that as well for certain aspects are the solidarity between the member states. If you're going to have, you know, binding, movements of people around and quotas and so on. And we know that didn't work last time. And that's the whole basis on which the EU works. I mean, that's why there's common institutions and so on. So I think the emotional part and how we regard, you know, law, and I suppose the flip side of it is we say, well, you know, in order to, and what I was arguing is that, you know, well, we need to make sure that, you know, international law is well, but again, there you've got to look at the question of enforcement. You know, it's okay saying, well, I have these rights documented in this document, and so what sometimes can be the answer. How do we get beyond that? So I think the role of emotion there is extremely important. And, you know, I don't think you can really, you can look at this area of, in terms of the black letter law of what's there, but you have to go beyond that if you need to understand. And I think legal scholarship has done that really quite a lot in very, very many areas, and that's certainly the category of legal scholarship that I would put myself in. We're just not as good necessarily as doing empirical work on the ground to actually see what the effects of that are, but rather they might be assumed. I think I'm going to take a little bit of time just to read the two questions that have come in for me. So maybe I could pass over to Ali and then come back to me, if that's okay.
Great. Ali?
Hello. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Beste, for your comments, and I hope that I will be able to answer some of your important points. I will also mention, I think I'll start first with Hannah's question of that interaction. In my opinion, I'm pretty much on the same line with Paul here. Legal discourse is of course very important, but the legal discourse is embedded in a political discourse on migration governance, where emotions do a lot of work. So let me give you an example here. The newspaper article that I showed at the very beginning is an ongoing episode of particularly Home Office in the UK nowadays about changing certain legalities in terms of asylum applications. Particularly in the last 2 months, Home Office Twitter account in the UK is tweeting on how the legal requirements are limiting Home Office power to control the borders. So there is some emotional work going on there. The way that, you know, public opinion is shaped and reshaped against the law. So the law can be either changed or UK can easily dismiss itself that kind of law. So they are very much related to each other, and I think more work on the interaction of these two can be quite interesting. Regarding Beste's question, I completely agree with you, Beste, and I think states are excellent performers. They know how to put on a show. And when it comes to Erdogan, as you might also agree, he's very good at this kind of performances. So one thing that I do remember in that particular episode in February is the pride and happiness in the generic Turkish public opinion, at least in certain newspapers, you know, in polls or in Twitter accounts, you know, how we show Turkey, you know, something to Europe by, you know, opening the borders. You know, how we are more important than them. We are more powerful than them. So migrants there become a way as an instrument to make the public opinion quite proud when it comes to, you know, dealing with Europe. This is where the I think some neo-colonial emotions are quite important as well. And as you said it very rightly, that image that tens of thousands of people in the border actually did the emotional work a lot of, because the objective here is to generate fear and anxiety, particularly in the European capitals, so they could actually renegotiate what they've been discussing when it comes to what Turkey was doing in northern Syria. So actually, I think emotions did a lot of work there too. And when it comes to migration diplomacy, again, the way that states signal their interest to each other through using emotions can be an interesting area to study there. So I think I'm going to stop there here for a second and go back to questions.
Yeah, we have some questions. Maybe we'll start with the question we have from Christina Eckes for Paul. I'm just going to read it out. I would be interested in Paul's view on the substantive effects of informalization of migration policy. Informalization leads to power shifts, usually from the legislature and the courts to the executive. Do you see an effect of the shift on the substantive policies wording? Is there a difference between internal and external instruments?
Sure. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Okay. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and certainly the clearest way to see this is away from the courts. I mean, you know, the courts will not look at things which are not legal in this category in terms of, you know, its role, particularly when you talk about the Court of Justice. Of course, it can look at other things which are kind of allied in some way to directives and regulations, quite a lot on that, but that would seem to be the clearest shift away from the court, and can be, you know, regarded as a means of keeping the court out of things that the member states in particular might not want the court to have oversight of. And we see that reflected in the Treaty of Lisbon on as far as CFSP and so on is concerned as well, even though the practical impact of that might be more limited than it seemed. I mean, of course, we get into the slightly complex area, and as I referred to, the bodies involved in migration governance, then because you've got Frontex, because you've got others, and because you've got the more informal things like networks on returns and so on, it's like, well, okay, these are not decision-making bodies in a way. However, they are capable of producing effects, which can in turn have effects on the way the law is applied. I think the difficulty, and one of the constant difficulties that we have with the EU is, what do we regard as the executive? I mean, often we regard it, it's the council because the Commission's role is low. On the other hand, the Commission is responsible for proposing, the pact. So in terms of a shift on the wording, yeah, I mean, I think this does go back to the helpfulness in terms of the institution's use of vagueness of the informality of the words, because it's much more difficult to pin down what that means, and because these are words that we would use in everyday English or whatever language, it would be interesting, I suppose, to check all the languages of whether they mean something more specific. I suspect not. That if you mean, an agreement, then you say so, and if you don't mean an agreement, why are you not using that as well? I suppose that then leads to the question of, well, would it be possible to have, the EU-Turkey deal as a fully fledged agreement? Well, no doubt it would have taken a lot longer. There'd be opposition to it within the European Parliament, within perhaps civil society and so on, and it might have gone nowhere. Which means that, well, the Commission liked to trumpet this as a really as a really great thing because of the practical effects that it had, even though technically then the Commission wasn't actually involved in it, but it was, sort of part of this, the sort of push to say, well, we can be effective. We are doing things that's asked of us. So I suppose then you've got you sort of get into a sort of circular argument of, well, does it actually benefit the Commission in terms of power or not? And I suspect that it does. What I would also say about there was a question later on. I didn't quite get what was meant by monetization from Louisa, and I tried sort of chatting to see, can you define that more? But the facility doesn't allow us to do that, so apologies for that.
Maybe Louisa can send a follow-up question too.
Well, I think I can answer. I hope I can answer in that I did say that it contains more law or proposals for hard law. This is in comparison with where it's in before. It seems that the focus is about redoing the law that's already there or recasting directives. And actually, if you unpick it, and I haven't gone through everything because, well, there's 300 pages of it attached, but I have looked at other legal commentaries. Once you unpick it a bit, there's perhaps not as much which is new there. What was interesting for me is that in previous documents where the emphasis seemed to be on the informality, here there appears to be a shift back. But again, it might tell us more about what actually plays, which again could be the emotion. Is this something where people think that the law is important to stop this or to allow this or whatever? And what interests me is then almost what's not said. So when the potential for cooperation with third countries gets mentioned in very broad and vague terms, but without anything more. And I would have expected, if the EU-Turkey statement was such a success, that actually more would have been made of this in a way in which could be used in different contexts with other countries. So you do get sort of differentiated approaches and so on. So perhaps here it's just not being mentioned as much as it might be. Yeah, so that I hope also speaks to the question underneath as well about suggesting it turn back to hard law. I do, but only perhaps in the way it's presented, not necessarily in the way it's done. And of course, this is only a proposal, and we already know from the passage of directives in this area before that it does take a very long time. So just because something is being proposed, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be watered down or go back and forth, or, as often happened as well, simply dropped.
Thank you, Paul. Let me pass on some questions to Ali. Specifically, there's a question here from Natalie Welfens. She says, thank you for a fascinating, insightful presentation. Would you link the concept of affective bordering only to exclusion or also to inclusion? And could you expand a bit on the gender dimension of affective bordering? For instance, are there also instances of feminine performance of sovereignty?
Yeah. And
maybe, maybe you can also already start reflecting on the question from Lisa Verashevich, which was for both of you, on the notion of solidarity. yeah, I think just asking you to reflect on whether there is this notion now emerging, what this means with the new pact on migration.
Yeah, thank you.
Whether it's actually more about member states and migrants. Sorry, now I'm done. I'll pass on to you.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I guess we are finishing at 12. Yeah. Okay. So okay, I'll try to be very quick. Two big questions. So basically, particularly in international relations, sovereignty is associated always with masculinity because we do live in a patriarchal structure. Masculinity is about protection, ruling, domination, strength, proactiveness, etc., etc. But masculinity does not come in one form; it comes in different forms. When it comes to such as warrior masculinity or more liberal masculinity, and the Western context. Particularly Western states are quite good at bringing these two different dimensions of masculinity in their performances. Why it is not associated with femininity is because in patriarchal structure masculinities are valued and the femininity is devalued. So sovereignty as an institution is about domination and obedience, is one of the questions actually underlined. It is historically been associated with masculinity. So I'm not sure we can associate it with femininity or feminine state performances in that way. It would be automatically devalued in a patriarchal structure, but of course it does include inclusion as well. After all, compassion, this compassionate warrior, is including some of the migrants, especially if you look at, I don't know if you have a chance to look at, I can share that link in the chat box later. Dan Mahoney in that article says that UK is resettling 25,000 refugees every year. This is about a kind of legal inclusion into their society as a side of compassion. And of course, what they don't say here is the resettlement is very, very, very different from irregular arrivals on border. It's a completely different system, but they don't mention that. When it comes to, I hope that answers your question a bit. Yes. On solidarity question, I think that's again here the way that migration governance works in the EU, and I'm sorry if I'm stepping on Paul's research right now. So Paul, please correct me if I'm wrong. Migration governance has been politicized as something that is constantly and repeatedly disturbs solidarity, European solidarity and European identity by dividing certain countries between the center and those on the borders. And some countries, those on the borders, such as Hungary, as they did in migration so-called crisis in 2015, they perform a different sovereign sovereign show. And remember what they said: we are here to protect European civilization against this, well, he called Orban used the word Islamic invasion. Actually, if we go back to 2015, we see in some European states, especially some discourse in these European states is to represent themselves as the protectors of European civilization, and in this way to create some kind of solidarity with the core European. And what happened with the pact is a kind of divergence from that kind of discourse. It is more about burden sharing. And the interesting part of the pact, in my opinion, is that the focus has moved from resettlement to relocation to deportation, and burden sharing when it comes to deportation, when it comes to pact. So I think here there is some, again, effective work is going on here. This is a message not only to the member, not particularly the core, the populations of the core in Central European states, in core European states, but the populations in the border states, saying that the core states are helping you, in dealing with this problem, and you have no reason to look for alternative roads. So European solidarity is with you here. This is a very strong message there. So I'm going to stop here because only 3 minutes left.
Thank you. I was looking for. Okay. And Noemi Bedger's question was already answered, I think, with what you were was talking about. Otherwise, I would have passed it on to you as well. Paul, is there anything else you would like to comment on? Maybe last comment on the question of solidarity from your perspective?
I mean, I struggle with the solidarity point in terms of how I think about it, because as I said before, it underpins the whole of EU law. I mean, it works because of sort of base nature of, well, you have pooled sovereignty as a means of pursuing certain goals, and as soon as that starts to break down, then there is no European Union in one sense, in one area, which I suppose is why it's is why it's interesting that going through the idea of recasting or recasting things which are seen as a problem for solidarity, Dublin and so on being amongst them, is there. But it's the solidarity aspect is one thing that I have that I have struggled with. And again, even though I wouldn't define myself as a sort of doctrinal, sort of hard-nosed lawyer, it's when they say, well, you either obey something or you don't. So that's why for me it's something that I've always found tricky, and not all the lawyers have, but it's something that I've found to be tricky to comprehend in terms of how that works into thinking, if that helps.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe this is a good way to close the session on time. We have been thinking also now about the new EU Migration Pact, and we'll see what will happen there in the next month. I would like to thank Paul and Ali and Beste for being here today, for sharing your research and your contributions. And I would also like to thank Dimitris again for helping organize this, and Lisa for the technical support. And last but not least, I would like to thank the audience for all your questions. I'm sorry we did not manage to answer all of the questions. Maybe Paul and Ali can still write. But yeah, thanks so much for being here. I have 2 small announcements for anyone who would like to hear more about EU migration policy. There's another event actually coming up with the ACES on the 27th of October. With Professor Saskia Stachowicz from the University of Vienna. She will talk about Frontex and gender and race. And if you don't know it yet, Beste Ishlien and Tasnim Anwar are currently hosting the second part of their series, Decolonizing Europe. And there is another session this Thursday, if I'm correct. But check it out on the website of ACES. Thank you. Wednesday.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the speakers. Have a nice day everyone, and take care.